Here, let's go ahead and get started. So before we move into motor pathways, I want to talk a little bit about pain and what pathway carries pain. No cheating. I saw your eyes wander over there.
Oh no, posterior.
Posterior is joint sense, discriminatory touch, vibration. Spinal thalamic is pain, crude touch, pressure, and temperature. So pain is going to be carried by the spinal thalamic tract, and I have the lateral one up here. All right. The discussion of pain is on 115 of your lecture notes, pain transmission. So it would be from this pathway, and I'm not going to draw it on the pathway structures because I'm going to save that for motor. But remember what you guys remember what pain receptors are known as? Pressure receptors are B. Baroreceptors, remember that's what glossopharyngeal nerve and vagus nerve did in the blood vessels. Chemoreceptors are for carbon dioxide and oxygen and hydrogen ions. Pain receptors are known as nociceptor. It's a weird word. It's where we get noxious. Not every noxious substance is always painful, but different kinds of stimuli can be painful, all right? Something that's warm, when it gets too hot, is painful, all right? A touch can be fine, but even pressure can become painful if it's heavy pressure, so it doesn't always have to start out as a painful structure. So we have our nociceptors, and they are going to synapse with dendrites. Remember, our sensory neurons have dendritic ends, and then a very long process that carries that back to the cell body. So chemicals released between the nociceptor and the dendrite of our sensory neuron are primarily ADP and or bradykinin. And if there's sufficient amounts of those released, these would be chemically gated channels, so they would be receptors for these molecules. And if there's sufficient channels open to excite this neuron, it would send an electrical current back through the pseudo-unipolar neuron into the posterior gray horn, because this is pain and temperature. All right, so this would be the posterior gray horn. This would be skin or viscera. And in the posterior gray horn, we have two major neurotransmitters that are released by this first neuron. Glutamate, which we'll talk about in our next unit as the major excitatory neurotransmitter, and substance P. All right, so that's the first order neuron. And then the second order neuron would bind these substances, and this neuron would cross in the spinal cord, remember, and would ascend and end up in the thalamus. So this region is posterior gray, posterior gray horn. And then the cell bodies of the thalamus are going to go to the postcentral gyrus. I know it doesn't look anything like this pathway over here, but it's following the same. Okay. So in our next, so this is the lateral spinal thalamic tract. So the major sites for blockage of pain transmission is either here with local anesthetics, all right? As far as the central nervous system is concerned, it's here. So you've heard of exercising and producing endorphins, all right? Certain other molecules, such as serotonin, can be produced by descending molecules that will block these chemicals here from activating the second order neuron. So that's the most common side of the body's attempt to deal with pain, okay, is between the first order neuron and the second order neuron in the posterior gray horn for this spinothalamic pathway. Now, pain can still reach the post-central gray matter and not be processed. You've probably heard about someone in battle who had severe life-threatening injuries and went and saved other people, and heroically, but at the time they'll say they didn't even realize that they themselves were injured, okay? Or someone playing in a football game or a soccer game and having a bone broken and continuing to play. Under those circumstances, this pathway is still working, but the cortical area of the brain is so busy processing other incoming stimuli, the gray matter in the cortex of the brain doesn't process that incoming pain. So it's still making its way up through the thalamus, but when it gets here, those processing cells are too busy doing other incoming input to process the pain, at least to the degree that it is processed later. All right, so we'll talk about these neurotransmitters in more detail in our next unit when we actually follow the pathway. But since we were doing the lateral spinothalamic pathway, I wanted to mention them here. All right, let's look at motor pathways now. And although there are 5, they are not as difficult as it seems. We only have 2 neurons that we're talking about in each pathway. All right? So, can I erase this pink thing here? There's that. So the 2 types of efferent neurons that we find in our cranial or spinal nerves have the word efferent, meaning they're carrying information away from the central nervous system. And the type that we're going to be talking about today are voluntary. They're activating skeletal muscle. So they are known as general somatic efferent, right, for skeletal muscle. And we will be looking at general visceral efferent when we talk about the autonomic nervous system after this exam. So that's the glands. That's what the vagus, well, let's do a little bit of review. What 4 cranial nerves carry general visceral efferent fibers for parasympathetic? We do glands, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. All right, so where do we have smooth muscle and glands in the face? Pardon? No, hypoglossal is skeletal. But we do have glands under the tongue, salivary glands. So what cranial nerve does the salivary glands under the tongue? Glossopharyngeal does the major salivary gland by the ear. But that's, yeah, that would be one. So general visceral efferent cranial nerves would be cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal to the parotid gland. So just because it's efferent doesn't mean it has to go to a muscle, okay? So this is the salivary gland. What does it to the other 2 salivary glands and also to the lacrimal gland? Facial. And do we have any smooth muscle in the face that we have innervated by cranial nerves? Optic. No, not optic.
Oculomotor.
Oculomotor. Close. Optic is the sensory part of the reflex. So The ocular motor goes to the smooth muscle in the eye for the ciliary muscle, the lens, and the iris muscle. Okay? And then I mentioned the fourth one already, vagus. It goes to glands, smooth, and cardiac muscle. So those would all be general visceral efferent. But today, we're finishing this unit by looking at general somatic efferent. All right? And the first pathway is, the first two pathways, we're going to draw on the same diagram. The cortical bulbar and cortical spinal tracts. Now, just a heads up here, you don't have to use too much brain power to figure this out on yourself or yourself. The 5 motor pathways, you can tell they're motor, and you can tell where the upper motor neuron is located by the name of the pathway. So we have 2 cortical pathways. We have cortical bulbar. Bulbar is the older name for the brainstem. And we have corticospinal. So this is a conscious pathway of movement because it starts in the cortex. All right? So those are the 2 of the 5, cortical bulbar and cortical spinal. They're essentially the same function, sending voluntary motor innervation to the skeletal muscles of the face and neck for cranial nerves, skeletal muscles of the neck and body for spinal nerves. All right? Those are the pyramidal tracts, the conscious tracts. And then from the brainstem, we have 3. We have tectospinal. That's the one we talked about already, where the head or the eyeballs move in response to hearing or seeing something move. All right, coming from the tectum of the midbrain, and we'll discuss that. We have the rubrospinal, coming from the red nucleus. And we have the vestibular spinal, coming from the vestibular nuclei for balance. Okay? So each by its name, you can tell whether it's a descending pathway or an ascending pathway. So let's look at the first one here, which is cortical bulbar. And you can draw this on your diagram for cortical spinal because they're essentially the same. I'll draw cortical bulbar on one side and cortical spinal on the other. All right, we have 2 neurons when we talk about these pathways. We have the upper motor neuron, and I know you've heard me refer to this term before when we were talking about peduncles and pyramids. And we have lower motor neuron. Where's the cell body of the lower motor neuron found? In the spinal cord. Where in the spinal cord would the cell body of the lower motor neuron be found? Pardon? They're nuclei, because the cell body's in it. Well, we don't call it a nucleus. It's a collection of nuclei that you know as the anterior gray horn. Gray matter because it's cell bodies. Motor, so it's anterior. Okay? So, same concept that we've had already. Now, cortical bulbar is for cranial nerves. Most cranial nerves will, well, I'll illustrate. You don't have to know which ones cross and which ones don't cross. Most of them have dual. They will stay on the same side and they will cross. All right, but I'm not getting into the specifics of which ones are which. But we don't have a specific area where they will cross like we do for the cortical spinal. So let me diagram it on the board. I'm going to, let's see what I'm going to do. What shall I do? I'm going to move my eyeball laterally. So, not trochlear, lateral, abduction, abducens, down and out is the cheater. So I'm just going to move it over here. You might see that I can see the whiteboard, the screen. All right, lateral rectus, abducens. So, was that a voluntary, conscious decision to do so? Yes. So, upper motor neuron is in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe, and it descends down between the globus pallidus and the thalamus, and passes through the cerebral peduncles, because it's voluntary motor, all right, And then when it gets into the pons, it's going to both go straight and go to that side, so it's bilateral, okay? This is usually a stronger effect, and that's where it's going to stop. And then the lower motor neuron would form the ocular motor nucleus, would form the abducens nucleus, and come out to form the cranial nerve. So this would be upper motor neuron, and this would be lower motor neuron. Okay. Trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal nerve does what muscles? Chewing muscles, all right? So trigeminal nerve comes down, and it has its nucleus in the pons, and then lower motor neuron. Goes out the cranial nerve, all right? So this would be cranial nerve 6, cranial nerve 5, and we could have the glossopharyngeal, okay, or the vagus nerves as well down here. So cortical bulbar tract is voluntary motor to the face, where the lower motor neurons are found in the brainstem. Now what if I want to go farther? Our typical motor pathway is all the way down to the spinal cord to do upper limbs and lower limbs and trunk, all right? So cortical, starting from the cortex and going to the spinal column. So again, these would be on both sides. All right, so I would have upper motor neurons going to my abducens nuclei and my trigeminal nuclei coming down from the left side of the brain as well. I just didn't draw them on there, okay? To help keep this clear, I'm going to do the cortical spinal tract in a different color, all right? So you can tell the difference between the fibers. So now we'll do cortical spinal, and this is what most of us think of as the motor pathway, our voluntary motor pathway. So you can draw it on that same diagram. And the lateral cortical spinal tract is what 85% of the fibers will follow. All right? After I draw it, I'll kind of illustrate what the other one is. But the lateral cortical spinal tract is the one that you need to recognize. So let's say I want to move my knee. I'll extend my knee. So upper motor neuron is still in the, that's what post, it's left over before, sorry. Precentral gyrus. Of the frontal lobe. And it will descend between the thalamus and the globus pallidus. It will also pass through the cerebral peduncles. And through the pons. And remember, some of these are going to go through the middle cerebellar peduncle. They'll synapse with pontine nuclei and go through the middle cerebellar peduncle, but we're not looking at those now. So this will continue down through the pyramid to the medullary, through the medulla to the medullary pyramids. And at the inferior portion of the medullary pyramid, 85% 95% of these fibers will cross. And again, they kind of cross at an angle. They don't just reach one level and make a right angle turn. They're going to come down and gradually slope over to the other side. So this is called the decussation of the pyramids. We talked about this in the medulla. And then it's going to travel down the opposite side of its origin and come into the anterior gray horn. So this is the upper motor neuron for the cortical spinal pathway. And the lower motor neuron is what makes up the anterior gray horn. Just like the cell bodies of the dorsal root ganglion were made, the sensory neurons made the dorsal root ganglion, cell bodies of lower motor neurons make the anterior gray horn. So this would be lower motor neuron. Now let's say that it didn't cross. Let's say it was part of the 15% that didn't cross. It's going to come down. Oops, it's going to come down in the anterior gray horn. Sorry, let me say that. It's going to come down the anterior white column, and then it's going to come over and still end up on that side. So it still crosses. It just is delayed. Why? I have no idea. Couldn't explain why. All right. But we're doing lateral cortical spinal tract, and that's when it crosses over and travels down the lateral white column.